Resources, and for the second segment, I'm pleased to welcome from the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, Bob Masterson, President and Chief Executive Officer, and David Podruzny, Vice President, Business and Economics. And thank you for joining us, gentlemen. And again, to you folks, I'm sorry we're running so late. We don't do this by design, I can tell you that. And for the benefit of all the committee members, I want to point out that a few of us met with both of our witnesses during the fact-finding visit to Sarnia, which was very enjoyable when we were there. So please proceed with your presentations, and then we'll go to questions.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honour to meet with this committee again and to follow up on the committee's tour in Sarnia last November. I have a few comments, and then we can move right into questions. Look forward to that. So during your session in Sarnia, we did discuss the growth potential of the industry, both in Canada and globally. We spent some time highlighting the rapid growth of the American chemistry sector, noting that there were over 250 projects underway with a book value of over 225 billion Canadian. And we noted that while Canada's seen some recent investments, we lag well behind our historical investment share of 10%. We also discussed the highly innovative nature of the chemistry industry. We noted that it accounts for 25% of all patents granted in the United States each year. And we also talked about the sector and gave some examples of the sector being a key enabler for emissions reductions in other sectors of the economy, notably transportation, buildings, energy, and agriculture. We spoke of our highly skilled workforce, 38% of whom are university graduates and earn an annual average salary of over $110,000, which is twice the manufacturing sector average. We shared some research with you from the International Energy Agency that demonstrated for every unit of greenhouse gas we emit in the production of our products, those chemicals that are produced result in a net reduction of 2.6 units of greenhouse gases during the product's life cycle. And a very good example of that is the use of modern chemistry-based insulation products in homes. And those are seen to avoid emissions more than 200 times greater than those released during their manufacture during the installation, end-of-life, and manufacture process. So you have a 200 times advantage. Yes, there's emissions associated with the production, but the use of that product avoids 200 times those emissions. Finally, we talked about actions taken in our own sector and that the responsible care companies in our membership have reduced their absolute emissions by over 66%, or 2/3, since 1992. So those are some things we talked about. I put those back on the table, but today I'd like to focus more on issues we didn't get to discuss in Sarnia, and those are namely issues associated with greenhouse gas management policies. And I have 4 key messages I wish to convey this evening, and as a departure point for some questions perhaps. So point 1, globally, the chemistry industry is a large, fast-growing industry with significant implications for global climate change. Annual sales of chemicals amount to over $5 trillion. We have growth rates well in excess of global GDP, in some cases twice global GDP, and we expect to reach over $6 trillion in sales by 2020. And that should come as no surprise. You've got larger and larger parts of the global population pursuing middle-class lifestyles, but also, as I mentioned, chemistry is the key solutions provider for many of the world's pressing sustainability problems, including climate change. So it's those trends that analysts use to predict that we will see a near tripling of the largest volume, what we call our platform chemicals, over the next 30 years. So a sector of that size and that growth rate has significant implications for global climate change. The chemistry sector alone accounts for about 10% of all global energy demand and roughly 7% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. My second point, and this is important, is that there's many different pathways to produce those high-volume platform industrial chemicals. If we look at just the 18 highest volume chemicals that form the basis of nearly all other chemistries, global production of those 18 chemicals alone is associated with 80% of energy use and 75% of greenhouse gas emissions in the sector. And this is the crucial point, though. There are many different pathways to produce each of those 18 chemistries, and each of those pathways has its own unique greenhouse gas profile. So if you think of this from a greenhouse gas perspective, and you think of a scale, at the low end of the scale, you have biochemicals, electrochemicals, which are notionally carbon-free, and you saw an example of that with the bioamber production facility in Sarnia. Next, you have chemicals made from 1 carbon molecule methane chemistries. Then you have 2 carbon molecule ethane chemistries, propane chemistries with 3 carbon molecules, naphtha-based chemistries with 5 and more carbon molecules, and on to the far end, the high end of the scale, where you have very high carbon molecule, heavy oil, and coal-based chemistries. And you might say, well, what does that matter? Well, let's just take a look at the case of methanol, which is produced here in Canada, in Alberta. The main pathway globally, but solely in Canada for producing methanol, is via methane, the key constituent of natural gas. If we look to Asia, where methane is not abundantly available, the fastest growing pathway to meet demand in that part of the globe is a coal to methanol pathway. And from a greenhouse gas perspective, that coal-based pathway to produce methanol results in 10 times the greenhouse gas emissions of methane-based methanol production in Canada. My third point tonight is that in Canada, we are so fortunate to have an embarrassing richness of the lowest carbon feedstocks available for chemistry production. We have ample access to emissions-free electricity to support a vibrant electrochemical sector. We have enormous biomass resources in an emerging biochemical sector. We have among the highest and richest reserves of natural gas and natural gas liquids that allow for chemical production from methane, ethane, and propane, which have the lowest greenhouse gas potential of all the remaining chemical feedstocks. And as an illustration for those of you that did get to Sarnia, when you consider the production of ethylene at Nova Chemical's Sarnia facility, ethylene is the largest volume platform chemical in the world. It's central to the production of nearly all the plastics that touch you every day of your life. 2/3 of the global production of that ethylene is from cracking high-carbon naphtha crude oil to naphtha and then further processing that to ethylene. The remainder, the other third of global demand, is met by cracking ethane directly to ethylene. And at Nova, you heard of their investment of over $500 million in recent years to convert that Sarnia facility to move from naphtha-based production to ethane-based production. And why is that important? Well, you should recall that ethane-based production of ethylene requires half as much energy and releases half as much greenhouse gas as does the more globally dominant naphtha-based production. So my fourth and final point is this. Frankly, Canadian public policy is failing to understand and respond to the 3 points I've raised above. In short, the path we're on is going to result in underutilization of Canada's low-carbon chemistry feedstocks and otherwise an overutilization of higher carbon feedstocks and other jurisdictions to meet global chemistry demand. From our perspective, that's poor public policy. We think it's bad for business, bad for workers, bad for communities in which we work, bad for Canada's balance of trade, deficit, and investment prospects, and ultimately it will have a negative impact on global greenhouse gas emissions.